I have a question about sort of long-term planning, that much of the sustainable energy movement is based on the fact that we've offered a lot of tax incentives and rebates and stuff like that. And many of your companies are taking advantage of that, and I think rightfully so. And many universities are taking advantage of that. Denison's looking at a PPA to install a huge solar array on one of its buildings. But I'd like to hear from you what your companies, or how your companies are preparing long-term for when those funds, not if, but when those funds cease to exist. And are you positioning yourselves in such a way to be able to operate without that government input?
I'll start with that because we, you're right. Solar energy today, the installation of it is dependent on government subsidy. So the point of subsidy, as I understand it, is to help new technologies come down in cost till they compete with old technologies. Part of the reason, at least that I'm involved in the Business Council for a Clean Economy, is that we have a, for lack of a better word, nothing comes to my mind right now, a jacked up energy policy, because we are still heavily subsidizing technologies that have been around a long time. Nuclear is not a new technology, and it is heavily subsidized. Oil is heavily subsidized. So we've got problems in the inherent base of all that stuff. So that's problem one that is a challenge. I think it's important to understand that it's not just new technologies that are currently subsidized, but I think the goal I would love to see is get some sort of level playing field across all those things and let these things compete where they are. Solar prices have probably fallen 45% over the last year. So costs are coming down dramatically. The more we manufacture, the more we install, those come down. So the hope is really that my hope is, personally from a business perspective, when I do the internal calculus of does this make sense, is two things. One is that, well, it's three things really. One is that the cost of conventional fuel is going to continue to rise. That's thing one. Thing two is that the cost of deploying renewable energy is going to fall. And then thing three is that we'll begin to get a energy policy that is more coherent. For example, just this recent study showed that there's about $120 billion in externalities out to our healthcare system and other things from the way we burn coal today. So we are paying for that. Make no mistake, everybody in this room pays for it. We just don't see it in our energy bill. So that makes it difficult when I compare the cost of solar versus the cost of coal, because we've given them $120 million behind the scenes. So my hope is that current costs will, I think they'll continue to rise. Renewable costs will come down, and we'll get some sort of comprehensive climate legislation that fairly prices electricity, and that'll make it to the point where you're not, where you don't need subsidy.
Anybody else on that one?
I'd say another way to think about that too is, my company is not at revenue generation yet, so tax credits don't really get us anything because we don't pay taxes. It would be nice to see something geared more towards non-revenue producing companies, or take that a step further, companies that don't pay out dividends, like Fortune 500 companies, and really sort of focus developmental monies towards those companies, because there's a lot of them in this region, and they certainly need a lot of help.
I'm going to take a shot at this from a different angle. Our company enjoys no subsidies in terms of what we do. There are federal tax credits available to us. There aren't investment credits of any kind. We have to go out and compete against coal, and we have to go out and compete against natural gas. That's the bad news. The good news is that, and I benchmarked this against one of the 4 Ohio utility companies. We produce electricity at the same price, at the same cost at which they produce coal. So that's the good news, is we're there. We don't need the incentives to compete. We have a very compelling economic model. But I think, as you pointed out earlier, this stuff isn't cheap to implement. If I'm going to sell a 5 or 6 megawatt unit where we can take heat out of the stack and actually give you back 6 megawatts of emission-free electricity on your site without tying into the grid, that costs millions of dollars, north of $10 million. So it's a capital question, and I have to convince in that process I think the expression was lots of white-haired old guys. I have to convince them that it's worth dipping into that operating or that capital budget to do that. And you know, one of the ways that I think Ohio is about to distinguish itself, particularly from the standpoint of creating early adoption in these markets, is with the Ohio Gateway Fund. It's a very important program in Ohio. It's going to take technologies, and I think I speak for everybody, although I'm not sure for you guys yet, maybe Steve on your end, you know, we're not bankable yet. We can't go get traditional financing because a bank is not going to say, oh, you don't have any cash flow yet, we'd love to give you a loan. Right? So the Gateway Fund is intended to bridge a little bit of the gap for the early adopters and their acquisition of technology at limited capital risk, and on our side of the fence where we're not quite bankable yet. And I think that's an important program. And so, you know, taking that a step further and understanding where there are other opportunities to distinguish Ohio as an environment that is friendly to that organic growth of an industry, both from the demand and the supply side. I think that's the real issue, at least from my perspective.
And let me just say quickly, the Energy Gateway Fund, for those of you who might not be familiar, was announced by Governor Strickland in his State of the State address. And I don't know if Nadine Howard is in the audience still, but the Department of Development is very involved in the process of selecting. There was an RFP, and certain venture capital managers have applied, and I think those results are going to be announced fairly soon. But it is something we need to keep an eye on because it is a very important program. Now, there was a question back there.